Hello everybody, welcome back to the session on project conflict. This is part 2, talking about how to manage project conflict. But before we dive into project conflict, let me first put it in proper context. What we have in front of us is the Strategic Business Execution Framework. That's PMO Advisory's proprietary framework on how to achieve business execution excellence. And we believe there are 4 components. There is the value, behavior, and attitude, as you see here. There are the integrating processes. There are the important competencies that the individuals and the team need to possess, as well as core disciplines. And on the next slide, you could see a little bit more detail that dives into the deeper side of the framework. For example, under important competencies, we have interpersonal skills, decision-making, problem-solving, managerial courage required for business execution. Project conflict in our framework is under core discipline, project management, and here you have project conflicts. Now, in part 1 of the project conflict, we primarily focus on what is project conflict, what are the positive and negative aspects of project conflict. In today's piece, we're going to focus on how to manage project conflict. And there are really 5 ways to manage project conflicts. This slide shows the 3 primary constructive ways of managing project conflict, starting by integrating. This is what we consider to be the best method of managing conflict. This is involved typically a high concern for not only your position, but for the other party's position. And in this approach, the idea is to come up with the best solution that satisfies both parties. Typically, we call it something like that, win-win. The second method is compromising. Compromising happens when you are considering splitting up the differences and the similarities. In some cases, you actually could call it a lose-lose proposition because both parties tend to lose something. Obviously, by losing hopefully something small, the goal is to win the overall situation and put it on the path of satisfactory for both parties. So that's compromising. The third is accommodating. Accommodating happens when your consideration for yourself, the interest, for example, is a little bit less than the consideration for others. And that happens in projects quite all the time. So for example, in a project in which there are multiple parties, the vice president of finance, even though he or she want to save money, happens all the time, understands that the importance of this project to the future of the organization is paramount, and hence the position of saving money is relatively weaker, and hence willing to accommodate, let's say, the vice president of product development to spend more time or energy or money to do a better quality product. These 3 are what we consider to be constructive because it is an attempt to find common ground and attempt to find the solution that's better than the individual pieces. There are 2 other techniques, and these are, even though called destructive techniques, they are real techniques, and that does use quite often. And there are places and time in which these techniques may be the most optimal. So take, for example, the first, the forcing. Generally speaking, it is considered the worst of the techniques. This is when the conflicting party does whatever it requires necessary to make sure that they prevail. And that especially happens and can be corrosive over time. But if you are in a situation in which, let's say, you are the leader of the team, but for some adamant reason, your team member disagrees with you, and yet a decision has to be made, the leader may very well choose to use the forcing technique to make a decision, because after all, it is, the buck stops with the leader. And even though it may not be a popular decision, but leader feels strongly about that. Again, in that situation, sometimes it's totally warranted. So the leader is going to force upon his decision upon the rest of the team, and he will prevail. Now, of course, I'm sure people realize if the situation turned out to be great, people quickly forgot the conflict. If the things turn out bad, then the leader may come to regret that at some future date. The other technique is avoiding. Avoiding sounds like the worst of the techniques. It is a relatively poor technique, sometimes called ignoring, withdrawing, lack of action. Analysis paralysis falls somewhat into this camp as well. But it is often a real technique, especially if it is explicitly used. And what I mean by that is on project, especially large conflict, there could be a ton of conflicts. Leaders and project teams have only limited resources. Thus, it becomes extremely important to focus on the few that is the most important. So, avoiding, while sounds like a little bit hands-off-ish, may be a real bona fide method for resolving certain conflicts. The hope is by avoiding it and focusing your attention on the more urgent ones, the ones that you avoid may essentially come out in resolving itself. But of course, as you can imagine, the worst case, avoiding the conflict may eventually come back in being more vicious and more conflicting than when it started. So use this method judiciously. I think it is a real method. It's a worthwhile approach to resolving certain conflict, but it should be done with intent and full knowledge that you're avoiding it. So the final slide on project conflict. Project conflict does matter. Project conflict matters to all project professional, because conflicts are almost everywhere, omnipresent on large and complex projects. It is just the nature of having multiple constraints boil into a small environment called a project. It can be very disruptive unless they're resolved or dealt with satisfactorily, and they can endanger a project. Yet, if managed properly, conflicts can be very positive. It's positive because it brings out the energy level. People in a constructive discussion of disagreements tend to come out with more creative solutions. So that concludes our piece on project conflict. We hope you find this to be useful. And if it is, feel free to come back to our site and see our other videos on the various other project components. Thank you very much and have a good day.